Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Jackie, and I'd like to start off by asking, is anyone here familiar with Tesla and the timeline for the fully autonomous car? Okay, so in case you didn't, I'd like to clarify now that the Tesla's fully autonomous cars, which would be the fifth and final level in the series, do not have a set release date. However, many companies, in addition to Tesla, have begun testing and even applying autonomous features to their cars. Now that those assumptions have been taken care of, the definition. For this speech, or for this refutation, a self-driving car will be defined as a fully autonomous Level 5 vehicle that requires no human operator. Tonight, I will be refuting the speech given by my opponent on the proposition that self-driving cars will have a negative impact on the American public. Their secondary claims were 1. Self-driving cars fail to eliminate American safety concerns. 2. Self-driving cars threaten driving culture. And 3. Self-driving cars will negatively affect employment. My opponent failed to prove their proposition with these claims, and I will show this through a challenge of evidence and counterclaims. My opponent's first claim was that self-driving cars fail to eliminate American safety concerns. They went on to give statistics about the reluctance of the public to accept autonomous cars and gave examples of safety concerns. I challenge the relevancy of these statistics as evidence that my opponent provided. The statistics provided give a lot of information on how the Americans feel, but just because they are worried, this doesn't show anything about the development of the self-driving cars. These statistics show what they feel and does not prove that there will be reason for safety concern in the future. Without a doubt, there must have been worry when the cars were being developed and the airplane was being developed, but it has nothing to do with the future technological capacity. Therefore, this statistical evidence of how Americans feel should be dismissed. The second part of my opponent's evidence covered actual technological safety concerns. My opponent cited a New York Times article that discusses poor weather and how it can be detrimental to self-driving cars. However, in the same article, the author says automakers are confident that technology can improve. Mercedes-Benz already offers a car with 23 sensors that detects guardrails, barriers, oncoming traffic, and roadside trees to keep the vehicle in its lane, even on roads with no white lines. I would also like to share another quote from Tim Samuels of Digital Journal. He reports, "What is interesting about the new research, other than the improved accuracy, is that the method can generate accurate distant measurements through fog. Assessing distance through fog has been a significant obstacle with the development of self-driving cars to date. This has been made possible with the added use of a gigahertz optical system. The system is better at compensating for fog compared to the standard lower frequency systems." So these quotes show that even in foggy and snowy weather and just generally bad weather, it's still possible that these self-driving cars can still be fully functional. My opponent's evidence for the secondary claim in essence cites studies that show that current self-driving car technology is imperfect. However, I would like to point out that a majority of the evidence comes from 2016. While this is not relatively long ago in terms of time, it is in terms of technology. I would like to go back to Tim Samuels' article where he published in December of 2017, about 2 months ago. He says the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have proposed a new approach to time-to-flight imaging, which increases its depth resolution 1,000-fold. This is a type of resolution that should make self-driving cars more practical and address safety concerns. This shows that while current technology is not perfect, there is definitely room for improvement in the future. In fact, Jeff Polgis of Consumer Reports states that most experts consulted for this story tend to agree that technologically, we're about 85 to 90% of the way to perfecting the hardware, guidance systems, and software to make vehicles that can reliably and safely drive themselves. In essence, just because the technology is currently flawed does not mean that it cannot be greatly improved for the future. Thus, my opponent's evidence for her first claim is dismissed because it is irrelevant and fails to support the claim that safety concerns will exist in the future. My opponent's next claim is that self-driving cars threaten driver culture. My opponent went on to explain how different areas might have different customs, for example, the California rolling stop. They argue that self-driving cars cannot understand these, and therefore, driver culture is threatened. What their point fails to consider is how the implementation of self-driving cars could actually improve driving situations. It would have to be up to the drivers themselves to adapt While many places have their customary manners when it comes to driving, with self-driving cars on the road, they would need to behave strictly according to the universal rules of the road. This would greatly improve road conditions, as many of the driver culture commonalities can be illegal and potentially dangerous. As a study by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration cited in 2015, a study found that 94% of critical car crashes are attributed to the drivers themselves. So it's apparent that the biggest danger to drivers are drivers themselves, and therefore the implementation of self-driving cars could actually improve driver culture by forcing them to drive as they should. Finally, my last point is that my opponent's evidence fails to support her proposition about unemployment. She did not get to this part in her speech, but I would like to point out that she did try to use statistics similar to those in her first claim. And going back to what I had initially said, those statistics about American feelings and expectations are irrelevant because they don't point out what will be in the future. Therefore, in conclusion, I hope you all understand why my opponent's evidence must be dismissed. And with no evidence, there is no argument. Therefore, my opponent failed to prove her proposition that self-driving cars will have a negative impact on the American public.
Well, obviously the first point was the one that got most of the attention. I think it probably took about 80% of your speech. And since you're kind of relying on some of the same arguments in the subsequent points, that's not too big a deal. The structure is fine at the beginning. You basically try to argue what the safety issues at the beginning on that first point, and you suggest that the public's attitudes are less relevant than documented results, and I think that that's a good answer on that particular point. I like the analogy to when cars first appeared, or maybe airplanes. I think that there would probably be some information that you could use to support that, but I do think the analogy is pretty good. And then you've got several technology developments that are addressing these kinds of issues, like the weather point and the issue about the fog measurements that I think show that the technology is getting better all the time, and there's always something in the long range that is going to address those reservations that people have. I think you want to go back to that first point that you're saying. You know, nobody is saying that we're going to have autonomous cars tomorrow. We are basically in whatever step it is, I don't know, 3 or 4 in the process. We're a ways from step number 5, which is the one that you're talking about. And you say, when we get to step 5, that'll be when we have all of these kinds of things. And then all the stuff that the advocates talked about will be moot because they'll address those particular issues. And you're showing how that's the case. So I think that that's a good general response there. I did like the technology one, suggesting that more recent information changes this. Even though their evidence came from 2016, which is only a couple of years ago, you're suggesting that there are constant developments in the technology that change things. I like the one that you mentioned. I think actually it came before this, that it improved the ability to do this 1,000-fold. That's a pretty quick turnaround and a substantial improvement. You've got this general statement that says we're about 85 to 90% of the way to getting to where we need to be in order for these cars to function this particular way. And I think you just come back and say, so on the timeline sort of issue, well, we may not be able to say with confidence that today we're in this situation. It's a short amount of time to make that leap, and there are going to be changes here. On the driver cultural thing, I would just look at their argument. If they're using the California stop as an example of driver culture, I think you've got the right answer here. Let's stop doing that. You know, let's have some universal rules on this. I think there are better examples that they could have come up with. For example, turning on a red light. You can't turn right on a red light in some parts of the country. You can turn right on a red light in most parts of the California, for instance. The pulling into the intersection to make a left turn. There are some parts of the country where if you pull into the intersection before you turn, it's a citation. Here, we expect people to pull into the intersection to make their left turns, and that's it. So when you say we should follow a universal set of rules, I think that might be an adjustment that you would need to talk about. But I'm not sure their example is the one that works best, for this particular point. I think you've got a good argument here, but they might have a good argument. They just didn't make the better version of it. So it's an interesting point. All right, thank you.